So I wanted to introduce Nicolas Brusson. I know many of you know him, one of the best-known entrepreneurs in Europe. You have, what, 20 million users over a global basis, 300 employees, is that correct? Okay. And I've asked each of the speakers, actually they raised 100 million funding round last year. It's one of the largest fundings in Europe. And then I've asked some of the speakers to give unique facts about themselves. So this is a rather cute story from Nicolas. He was one of, obviously, the first users of his own product, and he would be going from Paris to Brussels back and forth to see his girlfriend. And yeah, so I guess you are the biggest evangelist of your own product. So with that, Nicolas Brusson.
To understand. All right, so thanks for having me. I've been in tech and in startups or venture capital for almost 15 years, actually. I started that in 99, 2000 in Silicon Valley. And one of the things I've been hearing a lot, and you guys have been hearing a lot as European entrepreneurs or startuppers, is why don't we have a Google of Europe? Why don't we have the Amazon, eBay, or Intel or Cisco of Europe? And it's been sort of haunting me for the last maybe like 8, 10 years, actually. Like, why can't we do that? What's missing in Europe? What's not happening in Europe? And in a way, and that's what I'll talk about today, I think it's changing now, right? So I think today we're seeing like the first companies that will become or are about to become like the giant tech leaders born in Europe. So what I'll do is I'll talk about that. I'll talk a bit about BlaBlaCar and what we've learned and what we've done at BlaBlaCar and how we're trying to do that. And we're still very much in process of trying to do that and share some thoughts. So let me just talk about BlaBlaCar very quickly so that you understand what we do and where we are. So at the end, it's a very, very simple product, right? It's a very simple service. It's city-to-city ride sharing. So it's a community of people, drivers and passengers, that share the rides between cities. So very basically, if you're driving from, let's say, Amsterdam to Brussels or Paris, you would go to BlaBlaCar and you would say, hey, I have 3 empty seats in my car. I'm going to offer those seats for, let's say, 25 euro. And then passengers actually book the seats, very much like they would book a train ticket or a bus ticket. And people end up traveling together, sharing an experience, sharing a cost. And essentially, we enable this low-cost, last-minute travel all across Europe. So it started as a simple idea, a bit of a funky idea that people thought was like hitchhiking for weird people. And it's true, like, we had like a really hard time at the beginning to fundraise and convince people that that was disrupting transport because people saw that for what it was back then, which was like hitchhiking for weird people. Now it's not just for a few people because today, so it's actually data from March, actually it's 15 million members across Europe, Russia, India, more recently Mexico, actually using the service, right? So we have 15 million members, and in fact, as Bindi was saying, now it's over 20 million because we acquired a company in Germany. So today it's about 21 million people actually doing that all over Europe. So BlaBlaCar today is bigger than this country actually as a community, and I hope that in a couple of years it's going to be bigger than any European country. So, of course, we've done that because even though we started as a French company, as you can probably tell from my name and my accent, very quickly we went abroad, right? So there was no way for us to build this community and to build this potential by just being a French company. So very quickly we decided to expand all across Europe and now in more countries. So going back to European companies and how do we build European giants, the first question I was always asking myself was, is Europe big enough as an ocean? Is the market the problem, essentially? Do we have like a market problem in Europe? And I'll just share some figures that you guys know intuitively. If you look at Europe in terms of like number of people, if you look at Europe in terms of like smartphone penetration, cars, people buying food, people buying clothing, people traveling, people consuming data, actually Europe as a market, if you think of that as a unified market, which is not, but if you think of it as a unified market, actually Europe is as big, if not bigger than the US. And if you think of it like US companies understand that, right? When US companies come to Europe, they tackle all of Europe at once, right? Airbnb, Uber, all these companies think of Europe as being very significant as a market. Another way to think of that is to look at GDP, right? So are we producing in Europe? Are we consuming in Europe? Hell yeah. actually, Europe is still one of, if not the biggest market in the world, right? It's bigger than China, it's as big or bigger than the US. So we have lots of consumers. So if you're doing anything consumer related, either B2C, C2C, B2B2C, actually there are tons and tons of people consuming in Europe. So very quickly you come to the conclusion that Europe is not the problem. Maybe it's the way we address the market in Europe that's the problem, but it's not like the size of the market that's stopping us from building a giant company. So then we looked at, and I looked at that, I looked at like, maybe we just suck at building companies. Maybe historically we've never been good at building companies in Europe. And in fact, that's not true either, because if you look at like the top 100 companies by market cap in the world, you realize that Europe is, not as good as the US, but not that far, right? So you have 30 of the top 100 companies in size coming from Europe, and in terms of valuation, actually, it's a big chunk of the value is coming from Europe. So it's companies like, historically BMW and L'Oreal and so on. So we've been able to build these global companies from Europe. Now, if you think of tech, part of the issue is you come to this conclusion, which is pretty sad in a way, which is the ocean is big. There are lots of consumers in Europe, and somehow, the tech companies are pretty small, right? We're not building the Amazon, the eBay, the Google, the Facebook, the Twitter of Europe. And the staggering number is actually this one, right? So if you look at these top 100 companies in the world, and you just look at tech, right? And you look at how many tech companies are coming from Europe in terms of value, you realize that 80% or 79% of the value of tech companies is actually in the US. And in fact, if you look at the top 100 companies by market cap in the world, there is only one coming from Europe, and that's SAP, which is not the most exciting company you can imagine, right? But that's what we've done. That's the only company we placed in the top 100 companies in the world in the last 100 years, right, essentially. In the US, if you look at the list, you see new companies, Apple, kind of new, Google, 10, 15-year-old, Facebook is even more recent, and you have more and more companies actually getting to that category. More worrying in a way, like Alibaba and Tencent, two companies from China are bigger in terms of market cap than anything we've done in Europe so far. So the good news is if you look at what's going on now, I would say the fish in Europe are getting bigger, right? So I'll show some examples, and I think like 5 or 10 years ago, we would have been unable to show this list of companies. So today you find companies like Criteo, like Just Eat, that IPO, that like $1 billion+ valuation, and are still growing and defining the market. Here you see companies like Adyen for payment, which is probably one of the biggest payment provider in the world, TransferWise, King, Skype, Supercell, Spotify. And what's important about these companies is not just size, is if you think of these companies, they tend to be the best at what they do on a global scale. So for the first time, we are in Europe defining like category leaders. So we have these companies that define the space. Spotify is defining music streaming better than any company in the world. Skype was voice over IP, Adyen for payment, and so on and so on. Criteo for retargeting. So one of the questions I get pretty often, actually, either from the team or from people, is like, why the hell do you care? Why does it matter, right? Why does it matter to build big companies in Europe? And the reality is it's pretty risky to be a small fish, because two things can happen, right? So either you're going to be acquired, so it's nice, but essentially if you end up being acquired all the time as European companies, we fail to build an ecosystem, right? So we don't have this ecosystem of like large tech companies in Europe that can feed into the startup scene, essentially. So right now it matters for us as European in a way to build these giants, to build these like tech leaders in Europe. So I'll tell you a bit about BlaBlaCar and how we're addressing that and what we're doing, and share some thought on that. And hopefully it's going to be useful. It's very interesting for us. So the first thing we see, the first sort of like starting point for us was we need to find like a different scale-up model. Essentially, we cannot use like a US-style scaling model for very obvious reason, right? The US is a very unified market, single language, single culture, it's very large, so you can expand into the US and build like a hell of a company just in the US before you go international. In Europe, that doesn't work, right? Like France, Germany, UK, never mind about other countries, it's too small. It's too small. If you define that as your market, you're never going to be able to build a big company. And the other point here is there's a point about culture and culture template. So if you think of US startups, mostly Silicon Valley, today there is like a cultural template actually that you can apply not just in the US, but you can apply all over the world. it's very different for European companies, right? So we need to adapt a lot faster. And the key things we've done differently was scaling internationally very early, and essentially like adapting the culture to local markets, right? So we had to really adapt for every local market to define like, okay, Germany is different than France, and Spain is different than those two countries, and so on and so on. And that's how we won essentially all over Europe. But the key point for us was, as a starting DNA, essentially, we defined our market as being Europe. And very early on in the history of BlaBlaCar, we said, okay, our market is not France. Our market has to be Europe. And the way you hire, the way you staff, where you staff, the way you build your company and your technology and your product is impacted by that. So we had to sort of integrate all that multicultural aspect very early on in the company. And essentially the point that I just made is, essentially we did not want to be a national champion. We wanted to be like a European champion. And that makes a big difference, because the day you manage to do that, the day you manage to say, well, actually my home turf is Europe. Yeah, I'm number one in France, I'm number one in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, in Poland, then you can start actually to think much bigger. And if you look at the story of the company, we had the first employee essentially in the first tiny office in 2009, which was the worst time in history to fundraise, just the opposite of today, essentially. And 2010, we were in one country, and then you can see the evolution over time, and very quickly we expanded all over Europe and beyond. And if you look at the fundraising story of the company, it mirrors that growth, in a sense that 2009, we had to struggle for like a year, essentially, to raise 600K, like pitching to all kind of weird angels and people and whoever was willing to give money in 2009, post-Lehman Brothers. 2010, it was a tiny French company. 2011, it was a French company with a European ambition. And then suddenly in 2014, it was a European company. And you can see like the massive delta that suddenly if you say, okay, I'm a European company, we have like this strong foothold in Europe and we want to expand globally, then you can go and raise $100 million. And I think we would never have been able to do that and to get those investors and that amount of money without being able to say, we're not just a French company, we are a European company, and we have offices all over Europe. So one thing I wanted to share today and that we've done actually is this acquire strategy, and that we've done very early on. And most companies tend to do that at a later stage when they become pretty big. We've done that, like we've built that expertise in very early, to the point that today BlaBlaCar has acquired 7 companies, which is kind of weird, a bit strange for a startup to say like, we've been so acquisitive. And we use that to go into new markets. So I'll give you some examples, but the very first one we've done actually was Italy, and then Germany in a way, because Olivier was a German guy living in Italy and doing a BlaBlaCar in Italy called Posto in Auto. And we had this early discussion with Olivier saying, well, look, you're building this thing in Italy, we're building this thing in France, at some point we're going to compete, and someone is going to build that in Germany, and someone is going to build that in the UK, and it just doesn't make sense. At the end, we're going to end up with lots of small, tiny companies, and we're never going to go anywhere. So that was the first discussion. Olivier told me initially, like, I don't want to do that. I want to build my company. You're crazy. You don't have money. Walk away. And it took like a year of discussion and convincing, and eventually we've done it. And it was a great success, right? So we launched BlaBlaCar in Italy, great success. Suddenly we were in France and Italy. And then we started to replicate that strategy and build a team to say, okay, let's find all these like smart entrepreneurs, passionate entrepreneurs in all these countries wanting to do what we do, and let's essentially let's group everybody together to scale faster. So we've done that in Poland with Piotr, who was also had like a sort of a BlaBlaCar type company in Poland. After that, we've done that in Russia and Ukraine. Very interesting time actually, because Alexei started a company in Ukraine targeting the Russian market, and that was right in the middle. So we acquired the company right in the middle of the Ukraine-Russia crisis, which was like a very interesting discussion for me at the board actually, to explain that I was acquiring a company in Ukraine to go into Russia when something else was going on in the world. But you know what? It worked. So we've done that, and if you think long term, you're like, okay, what matters is like we need to create that service in Russia, we need to create that service in Ukraine, and these guys is fantastic, and we need to team up. We've done that again. I'm not going to show all the example in Eastern Europe, so you get the picture, right? So essentially, like whenever we find a good team, we team up. We've done that in Mexico just yesterday actually, and we announced the launch of Mexico. So to give you a sense of what happened and how it paid off, if you look at 2011, 2012, which was the moment where we raised $10 million to go European, the company was French, right? So if you look at the data, this thing is showing actually the number of new members joining the community. It was very much like a 100% French company. So nice, but not super exciting. And we had to build that like international community. And today you can see that 75% of the growth, and probably in a year it's going to be 95% of the growth, is actually coming from outside of the initial core market, which was France. And now it's coming from all over Europe, it's coming from Mexico, it's coming from Russia, it's coming from India, it's coming from all these countries. And our strategy of acqui-hiring worked really well, because essentially today 50% of the growth of BlaBlaCar is coming from these acquisitions we've done in different countries over time. So if you think of it, if we had not done these 7 acquisitions, we would be not even half the company we are, and we would be growing a lot slower, right? So it's really something that paid off, even though it's like a pretty complex exercise. Now the thing I wanted to share with you is, it's all nice, but actually there's a challenge here. Not just like doing this acqui-hire and integrating people, is as you do that and as you essentially like acquire a company and build sort of this like Lego, this puzzle of companies, it becomes pretty tricky to actually steer in the same direction, to keep values, to keep culture. So what we've done is, a year and a half ago, we recognized that, okay, one of the challenge with this strategy is going to be, how do you keep that common culture, that common vision, to steer the company in the same direction? And we decided to bring like all the team, and that was like a year, almost like a bit more than a year ago, all the team to the Alps for a long ski weekend, which was maybe more of a drinking weekend than a ski weekend. But so we put all the company in a room and we said, okay, guys, we need to define the values of the company. And every team from every department, every country came up with, here's what's BlaBlaCar in my country, here's what's BlaBlaCar in my team. And we came up with a set of, here we go. We came up with a set of value under the umbrella of fun and serious, because essentially what we do is fun and people enjoy that. But then we need to be like a very serious and very driven company as well. So I'm not going to go through all the values, but one thing you probably need to do, and for us it was very fundamental, is at some point you need to define that as the glue in your company as you scale in all these countries. Because today we operate like 12 offices, 19 countries, we have like 7 companies in a way we merge together over time. And unless you do that, you have this disjointed direction for the company. So on that note, and being conscious of time, I'm going to thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'll be walking around, I guess. So thank you.